And now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome our first panel of the symposium, fittingly a student panel. This panel is comprised of students from various disciplines, backgrounds, and institutions in Australia, and will explore what success means from the perspective of students. And may I invite the panel to start making their way on stage. It is my pleasure to introduce the moderator, Dr. Nicola Cull. Dr. Nicola Cull is the Associate Director of Equity and Inclusion at Australian Catholic University and the incoming President of Equity Practitioners in Higher Education Australia Association, EFIA. She leads the ACU's Equity and Inclusion Unit and plays a key role in driving the university's widening participation strategy. Nicola has extensive experience in equity strategy, program design, evaluation and research, including cross-institutional projects, and her work is informed by an interest in the interplay between structures and agency, particularly within higher education. She was awarded the Elizabeth Mary Dodd Prize in Education for her master's research on inclusive education and has completed a PhD with the Institute for Positive Psychology and Education, focusing on equity in higher education. I will leave it to Nicola to introduce the panelists, and thank you all for being here. Nicola.
Thank you so much, Ian. That was a lovely introduction. And hello, everyone. So this session is all about listening directly to our student panelists today. So we're going to start with brief introductions from each of our panel members here, and then we're going to move into a series of questions and discussion, and then there will be about 25 minutes for Q&A at the end. So please do submit your questions to the student panel for the end. Okay, so shall we start with you, Lachlan?
Hello, my name is Lachlan Sibir. I'm a proud Camilleri man, grown up in Western Sydney, Ontario country. I did my undergrad in teaching at ACU, so I'm a history teacher by trade. And then at ACU, I worked at IPPE, Institute of Positive Psychology and Education, looking at drivers and barriers to Indigenous success at university on a global scale. Once I did my undergrad, I went to the University of Sydney to do my honours in history, which I recently completed. And whilst I was there, I was very fortunate to work under Amani Bell on a fellowship looking at placement, poverty, and inequity. And yeah, that's me.
Brilliant. Hi, everyone. My name's Sam North. I'm studying at UNSW, and I'm studying a Bachelor of Advanced Science majoring in chemistry. I'm in my third year, and I'm very excited to be going on to honours next year and hopefully starting my PhD the year after. I come from a town called Goulburn, which is about an hour north of Canberra, 2 hours south of Sydney. It's Australia's first inland city. It has a population of 25,000. It's got the big marino. It's got the most secure prison in New South Wales. So it's a pretty colourful place. And yeah, I moved around a lot as a kid. So I was born in Sydney, but I moved Blue Mountains, Appin, Picton, Bowral. I went to Nerriga. Don't think anyone knows where that one is. And then Goulburn, and now I'm back up to Sydney to, do my academics and move on with my life. So yeah.
Thank you. Eunice?
Hello everyone, my name is Eunice and I also attend UNSW Sydney, and I am in my 6th and final year of a medicine degree. So fingers crossed, in a few months I'll be graduating as a junior doctor. Now, I'm very fortunate to live at the intersection of multiple different equity backgrounds. I'm culturally and linguistically diverse. I grew up in a lower SES region of Greater Western Sydney, and I also live with a disability and multiple chronic health issues. Ironically, one of them is a vision condition, which no one can see from the outside, but all of these experiences have made me a very passionate advocate for student well-being and equity and inclusion. And to that end, I'm very, very fortunate to hold a number of student leadership and advocacy positions within the university. Currently, I work as a senior university ambassador within the student equity team at UNSW, which involves me supporting the Gateway equity targets by delivering the Gateway Admission Pathway and Program. And I also chair the Student Health Advisory Committee, where we advocate for the wellbeing needs of all UNSW students by working with executive leadership and staff in the central wellbeing teams as well.
Thank you.
Namere bokmak yongomala, poko koropondo al balala poga malan, ngara dojot nyonga bokmak nguni dual, ngara boko koropondo al balala poga jamakoli nango, garagal yongomala nango ipor nguni yual kwatango ka tarai mediak balalapo. Pili ngara dual yongo wanga ka dial manmak ngor balalapo ngo walangal. Hello everyone. To this country and its people, on behalf of all present, I acknowledge this part of Mother Earth and her children, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the true traditional owners and cultural custodians of this land, for I am Yolngu speaking my language on their country. My name is Kayla Barker-Peris. I come from Larrakia country up in Darwin. I'm currently studying and living here at UTS on campus on the beautiful Gadigal country. I'm doing a double degree. I'm in my third year of a 5-year double degree in communications, digital social media, and international studies, majoring in Japanese language and culture, just to shake things up a bit. I also work at my old high school over in Rose Bay called Kambala. I work in the boarding house creating culturally safe spaces for the Indigenous students there. I also happen to be a peer tutor here at UTS, as well as a Indigenous student ambassador at the Jambana Indigenous Research Faculty. There we go. Thanks.
Thanks so much, everyone. It's so exciting to hear everyone's backgrounds. It's amazing. Thank you for having me. My name's Em. I was born in Zimbabwe, grew up on Noongar country, and now live on Wurundjeri country. So I'm very fortunate to have those perspectives and would like to acknowledge sovereignty was never ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I am a student advocate researcher of over a decade experience now in universities, now trying to finish a PhD in university equity that looks at the experiences of abnormative students, is the way that I've characterised it, and specifically the output is an intersectional quantitative data framework that should help with that. And so I carry a number of hats here, like everyone else, and I am also a disabled and neurodivergent researcher. Borrowing from the NDRP, just a short visual description, something that the NDRP does that I think is really valuable for people with vision impairment. But I'm a white woman with shoulder-length brownish red hair, a multicoloured plaid outfit, and large tortoiseshell glasses.
That's great. Thank you so much for introducing yourselves. And we're going to jump straight in with a question central to this session today, and that is, what does success in higher education mean to you? Kayla, would you like to start us off?
How did I know you were going to ask me first?
Caught my eye.
Well, to me personally, as an Indigenous woman, growing up in a culturally removed kind of space, being like in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, for those of you who know Sydney, you know what I'm talking about. I think that higher education is something that a lot of families have sort of put pressure on kids to go to and to kind of, get that degree so you can get those higher paying jobs. Coming from Darwin, from being the first in my family to attend university, like my immediate family, I do have one cousin who has graduated from uni, but being the first in my family, university was not a priority. It wasn't even really an option for me. When I told my mum that I wanted to go to university, her response was, actually, why don't you come home for a year, learn some domestic duties, work and make money, and then we'll see how we go. Unfortunately for her, that was 2019, which then turned into a 4-year gap year, thank you, COVID. And then at 2022, I decided I for myself, wanted to come back to uni. Since being here, it's been interesting. Family have this sort of idea that universities and higher education outside of, like a vet course like TAFE and things, are useless. It's a waste of time when you could be making money. It's, there's not much Indigenous representation or like successful representation in higher education. It's all, in sports and in media. And so I think that, to me, what was the question again?
What does success mean to you?
Thank you. Success is when you can do what you can. It's when, when you've been put onto a ball field and you're going to kick the goal and all of a sudden the game changes, but you still manage to kick it, or you manage to get that close to the goal, or you just go all the way to the left field and you miss completely, but you still had a go. I think that is what should determine success, or at least that's what determines success to me.
Can you expand a little bit on the game changing?
So, historically, Aboriginal people have been in positions where they haven't known the rules. They don't have the representation or the experience in a space, higher education, for example, where, we don't know how to operate. Where, like family for me on my dad's side, they're all living out on country, in community, speaking language, living off the land. And so they're getting their own form of higher education, and they have their own rules and their own sort of parameters set in place for higher education. But in this kind of form of higher education, we don't know how to operate, or if we do know, it has to come with like so much support. Luckily, UTS is very good at that. Thank you, Jambana. Where we have to have elders in place to sort of guide us. We have to have peer mentors who have been here, a year or 2 years before us. We have alumni come back sometimes and sort of guide us. But at the end of the day, especially for mob living off country and, even out of state, it's hard because you don't know the rules until you're playing the game, and it's just really tricky.
Thank you so much. Sam, would you like to go next?
Yeah, brilliant. So when I knew that I was going to be on this panel about student success, the first thing I thought was, what does success mean for me, not only personally, but as a regional student? And I live on university campus with a lot of other regional students who are also my friends. And so I had this conversation with them as well to, I guess, get some perspectives. And for so many of my friends, the kind of theme of their answer was leaving home to become trained or educated so that they could go back and they could serve their community or a community. And that was such an altruistic view that I kind of hadn't seen from this regional perspective, that all of my friends were kind of going, especially in the medicine and health fields, teaching, social work, that success looked like for them becoming trained so they could come back and help their community. And I kind of reflected, well, what does that also look like for me as well? And my story of moving to university and the barriers that are there. Because, for rural families, sometimes families live in these rural towns for generations and generations, and moving to universities or other higher education isn't just difficult, but can also be sometimes controversial. And for me, luckily, that wasn't the case, but it was difficult to move up to university. There's not only obviously being accepted to universities, but there's also just the logistics of moving. So that's the first challenge. But then there was the second challenge, which is how do you sustain yourself when you're up at university away from home? Because that takes resources. It's not only financial resources, but it's emotional support and other mentoring resources. And that's probably the primary region that I think is going underrepresented, at least for rural students. A lot of universities nowadays have equity pathways into university where they will remove barriers, or at least reduce the barriers for students from underrepresented backgrounds to access university. At UNSW, that looks like the UNSW Gateway Program, and I'm a proud recipient of coming through the UNSW Gateway Program. Just as Eunice, I'm also an ambassador in that regard. And yeah, UNSW does that in terms of removing the barrier, but there's still so much progress for universities to make in terms of ensuring that students, especially from rural and regional backgrounds, can continue to live at university. And so for me personally, success has been not only moving to university, but staying here. And that's looked like not only trying to find a way to financially support myself, but also find community up in Sydney, because that's really difficult. But when I really boiled it down to what does success look like for me, it was two things. It was security and it was purpose. And I think that at some level, success looks like that for everyone. It's finding security or finding purpose. And to my friends who are back in regional New South Wales, I think that for them coming to university so they could learn and go back and serve their community, that was purpose for them. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Sam. Lachlan, what does success mean to you?
Oh, that's a very hard question to answer because for me, success has been something that I've changed year after year or sometimes month after month. Originally going to uni, it was just to go to uni, you know, study and see how I go. And then like towards the end of it, it was, you know, all this array of stuff. It was get good results, you know, work on like equity pathways. So, you know, doing ambassador work. It was also, you know, making friends, socializing, all that sort of stuff. And I think that has been like the hard part over time is what does success look like? Because I'm still trying to figure that out in my student life. So yeah, I just finished my honours, but I want to go study further eventually, but trying to figure out what success looks like in that further study now after my honours. Something that I'm still trying to, you know, I guess come to grasp with. But one way that I usually look at it is I usually gauge my success off others, which is probably not the best way to do it, or how others see me. And if they see me as successful and in a good light, I usually see that as, okay, I think I'm on the right path. But yeah, just seeing how it goes at the moment and playing it by ear.
Thank you so much, Lachlan. You're right, it is a complex question, definitely. Em?
Thank you. I think there are two parts to my answer. The first one is listening to everyone. My personal experience after a decade in the university system, like I said, student advocate researcher, and having experience that are of quite a traumatic nature, engaging with the institutions that I've been a part of and other institutions, and particularly in negotiating difference and abnormativity in that space. Success for me is getting through the day. And I think that that's true for a lot of students, is that it becomes a very granular, everyday, like relational process of how do I make it to the next step, because we're trying to do something that a lot of the time is just an overwhelming feat, and it's really incredible to be able to be supported enough that you're able to get there. But for a lot of us, it's just not going to be the case, and I'm very privileged that I have the support to be able to do that. But that brings me to the second part of my answer, which is a little bit more of an academic exercise. But to me, success is the ability to take advantage of your opportunities, and that has two parts. And we're really good at talking about the first part, which we've spoken about on this panel explicitly, and that's the access part, and that's those pathways and all of the data that we collect on, you know, these equity groups and how do we get people into higher education. But the second part of it is the capacity to harness those opportunities. And we don't talk about that quite as much because it's much messier, and it relies a lot more on people, which they're not very easy to metricise, they're not easy to put KPIs on, and so they're very difficult in our current environment. But it's about the resources that you have access to, and a lot of that in Australia right now, and increasingly so, unfortunately, is down to privilege, and the capacity that you have to access those resources and then to harness, you know, to harness them to be able to actually succeed. So yeah.
That's great, thank you. And yeah, it's good to bring in that privilege conversation and intersectionalities. Eunice, what does it mean to you?
Thank you for that question. Now, I think a lot of us have already alluded to it on the panel, but I believe that there are actually many more indicators to success, far beyond just the traditional academic factors of passing your exams or graduating and getting a good job after university. I think for me, coming from multiple equity backgrounds, success actually looks like feeling represented within the university, feeling like I belong in a community in the university, and also maintaining and improving your health and well-being during that studying and during that journey as well. As a culturally and linguistically diverse student from Greater Western Sydney, it also means seeing diverse voices being represented at all levels of decision making throughout the university and into policy as well. I think it's really important to acknowledge that unfortunately tertiary education is inherently exclusive and inequitable by design, and unfortunately a lot of the people in decision making positions and in leadership don't come from the very diverse communities that these universities now seek to serve. we very rarely see leaders and decision makers who are open about being neurodivergent, for example, having a disability, coming from a low SES background. And I think that the more that we encourage that, the more that students from diverse backgrounds will feel safe enough to actually open up in university and to achieve their potential, like Em said. I think for me, within the university setting, that success has looked like taking part in various student consultation groups. I'm very privileged to now be a student representative on the Students as Partners consultative group at UNSW, and that is a group of diverse student representatives, including students who are carers, students who might be mature aged and coming back to university after a little time out, culturally and linguistically diverse students, students with disabilities, chronic health issues, and we are actually meaningfully engaged in conversations by the university and asked to consult on initiatives. And I think that that is a really great first step in encouraging diverse voices to be heard at all levels of decision making. Additionally, from a health and well-being perspective, and as someone who lives with chronic illnesses and a disability, and also from my experience having spoken to a lot of students as the chair of the Student Health Advisory Committee, I think that success also for students means being able to access and being aware of the supports that are available to them, especially in health and well-being. I think in this young adult period, it's so important that students are finding their footing and are aware and able to physically access and get to the help that they need. In particular for students with disabilities, I think that being able to access and implement appropriate educational adjustments is really important. And I think that this support needs to be provided in a timely, accessible, and coordinated manner, rather than a clunky and difficult one which burden students further. I think it's important to remember, especially for students with chronic health issues and disabilities, that even when we do achieve traditional quote-unquote academic success, many people often overlook the extra time, the extra effort, the extra energy that has gone into achieving that. And just because we're able to do the same outward indicators of success and to achieve those as our peers, it doesn't negate the fact that we need support and that there still needs to be an equal playing field. So I think overall, as many of us have all mentioned, I think that these student-focused measures of success are actually the gateway to achieving traditional academic success. If students don't feel like they belong or that they have a community, we cannot achieve that full potential.
Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives. Yeah, that was really complex, as we can see, isn't it? It's a complex question, complex answer. So many of you also mentioned challenges. So my next question is, could you tell us about one of the main challenges that you've encountered, and broaden that out to the bigger picture and systems if you'd like to as well. Who would like to start with that? I think they're looking at you, Em.
Great, I can go. I mean, I've got lots to say about all of it, so there we go. I think we're talking biggest challenges. I've got a few written down, some of which might be a little bit difficult to hear, so we're going to jump straight in. I think the first thing, like I was saying before, capacity to kind of harness those things, that harness opportunities, as we've all spoken about. Resourcing is a really big issue. The biggest challenges on my journey, I think, particularly, I'll speak to the postgrad experience from this panel, but I think resourcing of PhD students is, well, it's exploitative at this point in time. Australian universities rely on PhD students for a massive amount of output that then obviously goes into things like rankings and funding, and we live on 2/3 of minimum wage, which is not a living wage, and it is exploitation, pure and simple. So that's the first thing. But what that also means for PhD students, particularly in the humanities and social sciences, which we know are under attack, as we've all been saying, is a lack of that kind of resourcing and relational support. So the kind of basis of knowledge a lot of the time is that kind of Socratic dialogue and the ability to engage with your peers in that really meaningful conversation with your colleagues, with your peers. And a lot of the time that is actually just not possible because we don't have the resources and capacity to do so. So a few years ago I set up what I called the Hype and Vibes Club at Deakin, that was specifically a women and non-binary researcher group in the Faculty of Arts and Education. And we really struggled to have people attend, not because people didn't want to, but because they didn't have capacity to devote to that thing that they thought was going to be so pivotal to their success. They thought this is an incredible opportunity, but I have limited capacity in terms of my chronic health conditions or my cultural capacity. I need to give it to something that is going to be most enriching to me because I have such limited capacity by virtue of the situations that we are now placed in. So that's the first thing. I think I've also spoken to a bunch of people recently kind of throughout the student journey, and particularly teachers, particularly PhD researchers who've also done some teaching, and the lack of ability we have to give feedback, particularly when grading, the huge student course sizes, and the lack of ability to actually engage on that front also feels very exploitative. So the education system, while we kind of say a lot of things about equity and we talk really good game about how we want to move forward with equity, with all of these resourcing constraints that are specifically focused at cutting staff and cutting people, we're never going to get to where we want to go. So that's the biggest challenge. And I can probably end there because that's a lot.
Thank you. No, it's really important to bring in that structural as well as the cultural challenges, isn't it, and institutional as well. Sam, would you like to? Yep.
Yeah, could you just repeat the question again?
Sure. We're just thinking about a biggest challenge that you've encountered and maybe looking at it within the bigger picture too.
Yeah, so I kind of spoke a little bit before about the challenge that I faced, which was not like necessarily the logistics of moving to university, but how do I stay at university? I was supported by my parents in my first year of university, which was great, and I did receive some money through the Gateway program, but it was really the end of my first year and second year and beyond where I started to become concerned about the sustainability of living at university. You know, like just for some numbers, I pay, like, at least my first year, I paid $21,000 worth of rent, which was one of the cheaper options on university campus. And my scholarship pays for less than half of that. So the rest of that comes from myself, my work that I do through the university, and also a bit of Centrelink and my savings. So it's difficult, and I'm really lucky that at least I had part of a scholarship to help me there, but there are so many students that don't. And, you know, that's just the logistics, that's the financial aspect, but when I got towards the end of my first year, I hit this point where I really struggled, and I think I realized that I was a bit further from home than I realized. The excitement of moving up to university wore off, and I felt very vulnerable and alone. And I'm so, so lucky that I had not only my college there and some family in Sydney as well, but also things like the team, the university ambassadors that I'm with, to help actually remind me of the community that I had at university. Because for so many students, I can imagine as well, and like I know that the rates for, you know, moving it back home from university early in your degree is really high for regional students. Like I know that without those supports, like it would have been really difficult for me to stay at university. So yeah, I think that like moving forward, I'm really, really grateful to my university, not only for the work that I was given, but also the community that I could find in my college and also in my School of Chemistry.
Yeah, great, thank you. So again, you're looking at resources there, structural, but also community and cultural as well. Kayla?
I guess one of the biggest challenges I've noticed, both being a mentor to younger students who are in year 10, 11, 12, wanting to follow this tertiary pathway, as well as being a peer and being a student at university surrounded by other Indigenous students who have similar but not the same story as myself. The biggest challenge is probably the lack of cultural competency in the community. You know, Sydney is one of the biggest cities in the country. It's diverse in its own kind of way. It's, you know, you have a mix and a blend of different people from every walk of life possible. But kind of that lack of cultural competency is what I've found is the biggest challenge and biggest struggle. You know, being an Indigenous student, I've come in as a mature age, because apparently 22 is mature. As a mature age student into university, I'm not fresh out of high school, so I don't have that kind of HSC mindset going into it. I've got that lived experience where I worked in radio, in Indigenous radio up in the top end of the Northern Territory for the 4 years I was home. So I got to go out to community, I got to meet mobs from different language groups, different tribal areas, different countries, different regions, and that was awesome. And then I put myself down here, and just that cultural, almost not erasure. I feel like erasure is too harsh. It's more like a cultural sort of like distancing here. It's one of the biggest struggles I personally deal with all the time. You know, having that lack of, not consideration, lack of knowledge in my everyday life from others around me is why I do what I do, and I try to create those spaces for other people. They don't have to be Indigenous. They can be one of my friends who are an international student. I want to know all about like you and like how I can make you feel comfortable in this space and make you feel welcome. Like, I'm sure a lot of us have seen what's been going on in the news and what's been happening in all of our capital cities recently with protests and lovely people sharing their views with the public. And, you know, as an Indigenous person, as a First Nations woman, as a proud Yolngu Yarragidja woman, in Yolngu Mata, which is my father's language, we have a word called makarata, which, for those of you who may not be familiar, in English it translates to the coming together after a struggle. And I think that Australia, but in a sort of more localised term, tertiary education and this sphere that we all navigate in, is struggling. We are in a struggle. And as a proud Yolngu Yarragidja woman, I want to help and I want to create that space to provide makarata, to create that coming together, equal footing, everybody all together. But in order to do that, for me personally and for my peers up in Jumbana and even across other universities, other Indigenous students, cultural competency is the very first level of this.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really important. Lachlan, might go over to you because I've got in my mind your thesis after Kayla's comments. But yes, so if you'd like to talk us through a challenge.
Yeah, I can approach this question. I'm going to approach it from 3 different perspectives. As a student, then academic, researching this stuff, and then now as an educator at a university only recently. And I think from the perspective of myself, a barrier for university for me as a student was, I guess it gets to a certain point where you try to make changes, but there's too much red tape. The people that want to make changes as well are also stuck behind that, I guess, red tape, and it makes it difficult to do things either due to policy or opinions from the higher ups. And that's one thing as a student that I found really hard, because when I was at ACU, I represented the students on the First Nations Education Council. I don't remember the exact wording of it, but I remember I'd come with voices from the students, and a lot of the time it wouldn't really, I guess, go through because of higher ups, because of red tape. And I found that really difficult to work with in terms of making changes. And I guess later on now, I understand why that was difficult. And moving from that, looking at the barriers when doing some academic stuff, so first at IPPE, and then looking at the general broader scheme in my thesis. So just a recap for my thesis, my honours, I looked at how history was used in the referendum. And my whole argument was that basically history was not used enough. And the issue with Australian history is that it's very dual. It's 2 sides, and it forces us, the Australian society, to pick a side and run with it and not, negate the other side. And I think with that in mind, looking at academics, looking at barriers, looking at cultural competency, as talked earlier, a lot of people pick those sides and then negate it. And more recently, being an educator, I teach at ACU, doing an Indigenous education unit there. I've been talking to mob because I only teach mob in this unit, and they've all told me that they've had experiences with their lecturers, with their tutors, who are not culturally competent. And no matter what good things that the uni do, because unis do amazing things, when something small, insignificant, that, you know, could just be a comment is, you know, I guess, presented towards them. In this case, it was a student calling a tutor. He was like, brother, which is a term of endearment. They remember that. We remember that. And it kind of, I guess, becomes a barrier because, you know, no matter how welcomed or how many positive things that go on at the uni, it's a reminder that we don't feel truly welcome here. It's you know, a place that is different to what we know. So yeah.
Yeah, things can be slow, can't they, to change? Yeah, absolutely. Eunice.
Thank you. So I wanted to share my I wanted to share my experiences as a culturally and linguistically diverse person, and also as the first person in my family to do anything healthcare related and to do undergraduate studies in Australia. And I think these factors have given me a very unique perspective on some of the sociocultural and educational disparities that exist for us. And it became really pronounced when I was in year 12, first trying to figure out how to apply to university. My parents were not educated in Australia, and so they weren't really sure how to help me with that. They, beyond feeding me and, you know, encouraging me to do my work and do my homework and all of that, I didn't really know anyone who had done medicine. I didn't know anyone from my community who had been through the same pathway that I wanted to go down. And I really just had no clue how UAC worked to begin with, plain and simple. And so it made things really challenging, and it made me question very early on in year 12, you know, is university the path for me? Is medicine the right path for me? I don't know anyone from my community who's done this at all. And even having gone through almost 6 years of my degree now, there have been moments during my degree where I've looked around and seen, oh, I don't think any of my peers, any of my lecturers, any of my placement supervisors look like me, sound like me, are from the same communities as me. And that has made me question time and time again, do I have a future in medicine? Do I actually belong in this sort of community? And I think this goes to show the importance of having really diverse leadership and people in positions of power being open about their backgrounds and being those visible role models for us. So something that really helped was that our Faculty of Medicine and Health actually has something called a clinical mentoring scheme, where students can get paired up with an academic or a clinician of their choosing to access that one-on-one support and mentorship. And I was very fortunate to be paired up with a culturally and linguistically diverse person. He's an incredible doctor and professor, and he really understood exactly where I was coming from. He was able to understand the experiences that I'd had. He'd experienced something very similar, and that was a really pivotal moment for me when I met him in third year. And I was like, oh wow, someone has been through that. Someone understands what I'm experiencing. Someone knows how to support me through this, and that was really pivotal. It made me feel like I had a place in medicine. It made me feel like I belonged in medicine. It was really just a defining moment for my professional identity. And I think that, again, having those diverse voices being represented high up is so, so important for that. I think from a health and disability standpoint, I feel like another area for improvement is actually the standardisation of educational adjustments for students who require them. So for example, the university provides something called equitable learning plans, which allow students to access the appropriate adjustments that they need to succeed in their studies. And I think that this is a fantastic first step. However, unfortunately, what I hear from a lot of students and from my own experience is that these aren't actually implemented consistently throughout the university. And this is something that I've heard from multiple students across different universities as well, is that they're not always acknowledged when it comes down to the faculty or the school level. For me, that has looked like having to repeatedly advocate for myself, repeat my story, and to try and justify why I need support. It's meant being stuck in multiple meetings and emails, trying to be like, please, I need this, like the university has already approved it. It has also meant for me just being plain old, just said, no, this is quote unquote too impractical, sorry, we can't implement it. And I think ultimately, I don't think that this is out of malice. I think this is out of resourcing issues. I think it's out of a lack of awareness and education about the impacts that students might be facing and the need for this. And ultimately, I think that there is still room for improvement in this area to ensure that students are able to access the support that they need in a very coordinated manner.
Thank you so much. And I think that's a theme you've all brought up, some of the burden being put back on the individual when it's a system sort of problem doing that. So that actually is a really good segue into the next question, where we're going to zoom out a little bit, and I'm going to ask you, how can universities contribute more effectively to student success? Em, I'm looking at you.
Many thanks. I mean, people is the biggest one for me. People, funding people in both academic and professional roles, that allows for all of these things that we're talking about. I come from democratic representation kind of theory, and in feminist democratic representation, the critical mass argument kind of was a misrepresentation of what was originally proposed, which was that critical acts and critical actors are what's most important to moving the needle, not necessarily some sort of like number or percentage, but it's about which is again very easy to track and do in a kind of corporate manner. It's about people who are able to do those critical acts that make a difference, and that's what we've all experienced as something that's ameliorated those challenges. So funding people, pure and simple. As a graduate researcher, I will say again, fund your PhDs, please. It is impossible to live as a PhD researcher unless you have the privilege, such as I have and such as others have. As a kind of a little bit of a selfish interlude, but given that this is my research, we need to provide better forms of data that are lived experience led, intersectional and disaggregated, and that look at the situation in terms of what the experience of particular identity categories are, and not necessarily just applying normative assumptions to those identity categories. So problematizing that in a way that we can build up lived experience into data sets that allow us to more accurately and efficiently target resources. So there you go.
That's great. I can't wait for your final thesis. Sounds amazing. Who would like to?
Yeah, I can go next. So I think I was like reflecting when I was in high school as well. Being a rural student, your information and your kind of, your understanding of university, you're basically at the mercy of your career advisor, because, reflecting back when I was in year 12, like my mum had gone to university, but all of my information about application to university, what universities were out there, what degree possibilities were there, I was at the mercy of my career advisor. And she was quite good, but I still feel like I made an uninformed decision. As a future student recruitment university ambassador at UNSW, I go on career markets all the time. So I'll travel with the university and other universities to go to schools, usually in the Western Sydney area, to talk about university and show kids what options there are out there. And every single time I go out to a school, I think, where was this when I was in high school? Like, where was this? I remember in year 12, once Wollongong University came to our school, and I think sometimes they're kind of treated as like the regional university. And I know for a fact that Goulburn's biggest export is to Wollongong University as well. And I even went to Wollongong University on like a little open day kind of thing with my school. And it was the only university I'd ever been to. And I kind of went, oh my God, yeah, this is where I'm going to go. Like, Wollongong's so great. And, at that point, that was a very uninformed decision. It might not have been the wrong decision, but it was just uninformed. And there are just other things as well, like there are scholarships, of course, at any university, but at UNSW, when you come through the Gateway program, there's now this community scholarship, which pays entirely for your rent. It will pay $25,000 towards your rent. I had no clue about this when I was in year 12. In fact, it may not have actually existed. I think it came in the year after me. But yet again, that's the information I wasn't privy to. And it hurts so much to think, oh my goodness, I've just chucked $25,000 into the bin. Like, especially with like my financial struggles up at university, it hurts. It really hurts. So I just wish that universities gave more resources to rural schools. And I know that they do. And there are so many rural communities, and that's what makes it difficult. Like, I know universities do regional roadshows all the time, and like UNSW does as well. But like, they have, they're never coming to Goulburn, which is crazy because it's only 2 hours away. But I really wish for myself and for all my community members as well that they had that information.
Yeah, we have a lot of geographic disparities, don't we? Yeah. Lachlan, would you like to go next?
Yeah, just to repeat the questions about universities becoming more competent.
Well, the question itself was, what do you think universities, or how rather, can universities contribute more to students succeeding? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So continuing on from the from Em and Sam. Yep. Sorry. I think looking at it from a perspective, and I when I worked with Amani last year on the fellowship, we did workshops where we had, university academics, people who worked in unis in the admin scene, as well as students all come together to discuss, how can, placements become more equitable. And one thing I noticed, especially with university staff, and continuing on, is, funding and resource allocation in this sphere. And I think that universities, before they do anything, need to have a look at funding, in its entirety. Do an audit to say, look at where money's going, where money can be, taken away, where it can be given to support these great ideas presented already. So I feel like that needs to really be at the forefront, first step. So then, we can run with the strengths and really make changes continuing into the future.
Thank you so much, Lachlan. Kayla?
Running off of my earlier answer about implementing cultural competency and, making it mandatory. Like here at UTS, we have as a student, before you are allowed to go to any of your classes or live in Yuramudang, which is the residential housing here on campus, you have to completely do this training package called Consent Matters. And, that's important because you have to be sort of educated on consent when operating in the UTS campuses and in your classes and things. And, they have to do every single step, watch these videos, answer the quizzes after each section, and then you get a certificate. You upload it to your My Student Admin, the website with all of your profile things, and then it says, okay, you are consent aware, so you can now operate in this space. So it couldn't possibly be too hard to implement something that's cultural competency. It doesn't have to be Indigenous specific. I would love if it was, but just making people kind of aware and bringing, I said that, I'm just going to talk frankly, guys, I'm sorry. I was speaking to a Indigenous peer, I want to say a week ago, about when we operate in classes that, like Professor Kylie mentioned earlier, has embedded all of these Indigenous sort of perspectives and content within the curriculum. That's awesome. But then that also means that those Indigenous students in those classes have so much that they can, share, but then that also kind of like what you were saying, Em, puts the pressure on us to educate rather than, educating, raising our own education and our own knowledge and being able to participate in educated conversations because we're just bringing everybody up to the same level as us. And then on the flip side of that, we're also trying to operate in the space without knowing the rules, like I mentioned earlier. So it's all just one big circle of mess. So I think that, implementing cultural competency and sort of Indigenous education, even as just a first year subject, so then that way everybody is on that equal footing, everybody has a X level required knowledge of cultural competency, whether it's international, whether it's Sydney region, whether it's Indigenous, whatever, but just making sure that everybody's on that same level knowledge-wise, so then you can elevate those conversations in classes and around the community. And that's me.
That's so important. And again, it's come back to that cultural change, isn't it? And taking the burdens away. Thank you so much. Eunice.
Thank you. I think continuing on from my previous points, I think the most important thing that universities can do to continue supporting student success and student the student lens of success, and to do so in a very sustainable manner, is to actually actively embed diverse student voices across university decision making. Without student voices being present in decisions, they are not student-centered. We need to be centering the student lived experience in every decision that is made for students at a university level. And I think that it comes down to three main points that I wanted to briefly touch on. The first one is ensuring that diverse students are actually found from the university, rather than, I think we often see a over-reliance on, a select few students who might be elected into positions. I think that we actually need to be very conscious of the students that we are listening to and ensuring that they actually come from a very diverse and well-representative cohort. I think this honestly comes down to everyone's responsibility in sort of identifying those students and providing opportunities for those students to have those platforms. For myself, if anyone knew me in first year, I was extremely shy. I was so quiet. You would never catch me up on a stage doing a panel like this. And it was only because of a tutor, actually, at the end of first year when a university ambassador position came up. He tapped me on the shoulder after class and he was like, "Hey Eunice, have you thought of this thing? Have you seen this opportunity? I think you'd be great for it." And that was a really pivotal moment for me. I'd never considered that I would be the right person for that position. I never considered that, I would be the right person for this opportunity. I could make a difference here. I had all of these ideas, but no platform to share them and no platform to enact any real change. And so the first thing, I think, is to ensure that we actually get the right students involved and making sure that these are diverse and representative students. The second part is then to empower these students and to give them the space and the skills to advocate appropriately. I think that we shouldn't be assuming that students know how to advocate. I certainly didn't know how to pull together my personal narrative and share it in a coherent manner and draw out points from it when I first started. It was all down to the training that I was very fortunate to receive through the student equity team that I'm now able to do that. And I think it's really important that we remember that for a lot of students, advocacy and sharing their experiences doesn't come as second nature. It's something that needs to be fostered and mentored. And part of that comes down to ensuring that the university culture is safe enough for students to feel comfortable doing that. And that is a whole of university culture that is needed in terms of inclusivity and belonging, so that students feel empowered and safe to share what they want to say. And additionally, I think that the student voice actually needs to be facilitated and amplified by leadership and people in decision making at universities. Like Lachlan said, there's often a lot of red tape that hinders students or makes us worry about wanting to share what we have to say, because what if the leaders don't care or they don't want to listen, right? And so I think that decision makers and leaders within the university sector need to be working with and for us to amplify our voices to make that genuine change. And so I think this can be done across all levels of the university. So for example, at UNSW, within the classroom setting, we have course ambassadors where we can make real-time changes to courses as they happen. At the faculty level, we have student committees that work with faculty to improve the whole degree. And then at the university level, we have all of these committees and consultation groups. And I think this is a whole of university shift that needs to occur.
Thank you so much for that. Well, that's actually another really good segue, because before we go into Q&A, we've got a room full of university senior leaders here and policymakers. So what is one of the things that you would like the people in this room to take away from this discussion today? Over to you, Sam.
I think one of the biggest things is for universities, please spend time making connections with your students and giving them a sense of belonging at your university, because I know that probably one of the biggest things is actually through my work, through the student ambassador team, not only for my professional and personal development, but my connection to the university. Because I don't feel patriotic about many things in life, but UNSW has actually done a really good job of making me feel like I belong there. And that's been absolutely essential to my success at university. So yeah, if there's one thing, it's spend some time and make some effort into making sure that your students are inside your community and feel like they've got a sense of belonging.
Thank you, Sam. Lachlan?
Yeah, so continuing on from my last point, I feel like moving forward from today, I know we've probably overwhelmed you all with a lot of information about what can change and what can be done. And I think coming from a standpoint of, focus on one or a couple of things at a time, I think that's what you need to sort out in your own situations. What needs to be tackled first, what's the most important, and tackling that with all your energy, and then making, I guess, maybe a list that you can work your way through. Because if you try to tackle everything at once, it's not going to go anywhere. No progress is going to be made, rather than if you pick a few things you might want to work on, whether it be Indigenous education or rural students or whatever you have in mind, picking those key elements and really putting a lot of resources and effort into it, and then going on from there. Because like I said, if you try to tackle it all at once, it's going to be a lot harder to really make effective changes.
Thank you so much. And actually, I'm just looking at the Q&As here, and top is, university governance is under scrutiny right now. If you could give one piece of advice to Vice-Chancellors, what would it be? And I think you've done that, Lachlan, so excellent.
So I think in order to be actively improving student success and achieving all of these student-centred aspects of success that we've all spoken about, I think it's also really important, going off of Lachlan's point, for university leaders and policymakers to be working with students to actually examine and understand what those barriers are for students from diverse and equity backgrounds. I think through my work as a senior university ambassador for the student equity team, I have the privilege of working with some of the most incredible high school students from low SES areas and backgrounds. And I see how hardworking they are. I see how smart they are, how capable they are. And time again in the conversations that I have with them, the concerns that they raise for me are, Eunice, how am I going to physically get to university? How am I going to fund this? How am I going to resource this? There's so many practical barriers that students face, and these are things that I have faced in my own journey as well. For example, for me to get to UNSW and back home each day, that's a 3-hour round trip where I could be studying, sleeping, hobbies, anything else. And so I think it's by examining and truly addressing and tackling these practical barriers, only then can we make true change and impact. And I think, again, that comes down to working with students and hearing what we have to say. And I think that a forum like this today is a great opportunity to start those conversations. And I'm very grateful that we've all had the chance to share our pieces today.
Thank you, Eunice.
I think everything I wanted to say has been said by my deadly brothers and sister here off on the stage. I think that, like what Eunice literally just said, student voices. We say this in, when I'm in Indigenous spaces and yarning with mob, nothing about us without us. And I think we can draw on that concept and put it into this tertiary student sort of voice. And you don't make decisions unless you've heard from us. And yes, we have our our student council representatives, but how often are they from our backgrounds? How often do you have even just in an Indigenous context, you could have an elected student representative who's from the Sydney region, who grew up in Glebe, has lived in this area their entire life. They don't know about the experiences that I've had living in Darwin, or the cultural shock of moving from Darwin to Sydney. They don't know about my brother who's over from WA, who's living here in, trying to navigate not only the education system, but the system just of life in Sydney. It's a fast-paced place here. And, we're coming from mob who sit back, take it slow, listen to themselves, to our mobs, to our communities. So, yarning circles, it might seem silly, but literally just having a boardroom space, you can have your waters, you can have your Mentos on the tables, having circular conversations where everybody's equal and everyone can bring their points is so important. And, we always say, bring the topics to the table or bring the issues to the table for awareness. But where are these issues coming from? Are they diluted because a person or a program or something doesn't want to sound like they're not committing or they're not making those points? You want to hear at grassroots level, which is why this panel's pretty deadly. So yeah, I think that definitely having student-led voices and representation from actual diverse backgrounds and coming from those spaces is so important when you're making decisions. So that's my point.
Well said.
I will just extend that provocation a little bit because everyone, like Kayla said, has done an incredible job of talking to that kind of voice aspect of it. I think I would say that taking actually from, the literature on this, rather than focusing entirely on student voice, which is something that can get a little bit misconstrued because it might be a bit of a box-ticking exercise, I'd encourage people in the room, and I'm sure that this is, a welcome provocation, but to sit with your privilege and unpack your own assumptions and the incentives that you have as an academic or someone with an institutional position, and to unpack those assumptions and those incentives. The incentives part I think we often miss, whether it's towards, the maintenance of the institutional ego, for example, and to put those aside so that you can actually come with humility to these conversations and engage in that circular, non-hierarchical, humble way so that we focus a little bit more on that listening aspect as people with power to do that rather than, kind of transforming it into the potential box-ticking exercise of a student voice exercise, which is, as we've seen, we've all had opportunities and yet have come up against those barriers as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Coming back to the red tape again, Lachlan. So the first question then, our Q&A, actually links in with what you've been talking about in student voice. It says, in bringing your lived experience and unique expertise to discussions, policy development, decision-making, how are you compensated for your time and knowledge? You're shaking your head, Em.
No.
Tell us.
I mean, I will tell you, I was president of my undergraduate student association for 2 years, in which time I rebuilt the infrastructure of the association that did not exist at the beginning, and I, rewrote a constitution, put it through the kind of the governance frameworks, not only at the institution but at the state government level. And I went into a meeting with a member of the administration and I was laughed at when I said that I should be paid some form of salary. I suggested that presidents in the future, and I know that often presidents of student guilds are paid across Australia, but the response was laughter, and that is a response that is primarily given to advocates across the university sector. And I will say once again, PhD, Minister, you're right in front of me, I have to take this opportunity. PhDs are exploitation, pay 2/3 of living wage. Please at least bring that up to minimum wage, hopefully a living wage.
Beautiful. Kayla, because you mentioned before about the extra work you had to do in the classroom, how are you compensated?
Not monetarily, no. I'll give you an example of one of these moments I've had last year in a class. The class it's called Communicating Difference. It's a deadly class. It's really awesome. I actually very much enjoyed it. There was 1 week where we were talking about Indigenous representation in the media. And, one of the examples was a music video of an Indigenous rap artist who was out in his local community. And I think the song was called From the Mish, which is like a shortened slang word for the mission. And the teacher, who was a migrant, an international person, who didn't have the Aussie experience, bless her, doesn't know much about Indigenous communities and societies and culture. She asked the class, what is a mission and what is the mish? And this deadly brother boy behind me, bless his soul, put his hand up and he goes, I'm pretty sure it's short for Housing Commission. Now, I heard everybody chuckle or gasp or breathe just now. So you can understand, being the only Indigenous person in the room, I was doing these ones. I was like shaking. I was on so much edge. I had so much anxiety. about just being in that space, knowing that that was the level of knowledge that I was surrounded by. Knowing that it's not my responsibility to educate, but it's my responsibility to make the world, not the world, but just make this environment better for other people. Because I was having so much anxiety just being in that space. Imagine what someone younger than me, an Indigenous person who'd have to work under this person, someone who, you know, didn't have the knowledge to advocate for themselves and advocate for Indigenous people and educate others. So I was like, it's not my responsibility, but I took it on as my own responsibility, and I was not paid for that. I'm not paid to educate people. I'm not at that level of university yet. So, yeah, I'm not compensated, but I'd like to think that I'm, you know, tipping that first domino that has that flow-on effect to later helping someone else.
Yeah, thank you. That was so well articulated. We'll go to another question. Says, thank you for sharing. You're all amazing. We agree with that. You're all amazing. How many university staff know you really well, and what is the nature of your relationship with them? Who would like to start us off? Sam.
I would actually say that a lot of university staff know me really well. I think that that's both through the UNSW equity team and also the future student recruitment team. So I know a lot of staff through there, and also students as well, but also through my School of Chemistry as well. I have a really good relationship with a lot of the people within my school. Part of that was my own effort. I think, you know, it can be really daunting to make relationships with your academics and with your staff. But in my circumstance, it was necessary. Going back to what I was talking about, belonging, like being able to actually, because I live on campus as well, it's basically my whole life. Like I eat, I wake like there, I go to sleep, I do everything there. And so finding community was really important. So I feel like I did actually have the opportunity to make really good relationships with the staff on campus, but that opportunity isn't there for everyone. And for people who like struggle to motivate themselves, especially in that area, I can understand why it would be really difficult. Because yeah, there is a bit of segregation between student and staff, especially in academic settings.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking, Eunice, you talked about long commute before. So you mentioned it was fairly easy for you, Sam. You're living on campus, but what about, students that have like a 3-hour commute? Pass it.
Yeah, thank you. So I actually agree with Sam. I'm very lucky to have great relationships with a number of different staff members at the university. Many of them have been through the student equity team, through the future students recruitment team, and the different roles that I've held. I am also fortunate that I have several good, really strong relationships with a lot of the lecturers and support people in my faculty. However, like Sam has mentioned, that has come because of a very conscious effort on my part to try and belong and to try and fit in. I always tell people I very much found my community within the student equity team. That is where I found the most friends, the most understanding and the most empathy from my colleagues. And I think that it has been within the medicine and health field a much more conscious effort on my part to be like, okay, I know that I'm kind of at a disadvantage because no one in my family does anything vaguely related to healthcare. So I need to sort of find my own way. I need to find my own footing. How can I do that? The best way that I know how is to try and get to know the lecturers and hear from their perspective. And that has been a very conscious and a conscious decision and a lot of effort that has been put in on my part to try and do that, to try and even that playing field. However, like you mentioned, with that 3-hour commute, it does add up over time. And unfortunately, it means that I can't engage in as many activities as my peers who might live closer to campus or on campus. A lot of student activities, a lot of student engagement, things are often done after hours because there's classes, and that's totally understandable. But I think it's important to also remember that there are lots of students commuting a really long distance, or who might have caring responsibilities, might need to go to work as soon as they're done with class, that cannot engage in those activities. And I think it's important we consider them when running engagement activities and running outreach.
Definitely. We'll go to another question now. It says, how is the cost of your university degree affecting you right now within the cost of living crisis, and is it giving you pause about whether to continue? Lachlan, I feel like you're going to jump in.
Yeah, I'll speak to that. Obviously, degrees go in HECS, so I don't really notice it usually. But moving forward now from like my honours, looking what I want to do next, which is probably going to be a master's or a PhD, I guess the big push is, you know, will I be able to fund it and also put all my effort into that, you know, component of study. Now, I know with a PhD, they are usually free, and you do get paid, but the payment isn't, you know, as Em has said, not there. And with a master's, that's sometimes up to 100 grand added onto your HECS. And you got to consider, you know, for the future, that's going to affect your borrowing capacity for a house. You're going to have to pay those debts off. So with that in mind, it is a bit of a deterrence I found, especially in the postgraduate aspect of my study. However, I could see from a, I guess, undergraduate's perspective as well, especially if you're living out of home or you're not working, especially in today's day and age where everything is so expensive, it could also lead to, I guess, less participation in university activities, going out with your friends after class, yada, yada, yada. It's all, I guess, a flow and effect, I guess you could say, going into each other.
Thank you, Lachlan. Kayla?
I just kind of want to build off of what Lachlan's just shared. You know, next year I'm doing my honours degree over in Japan. I'm doing an exchange for the year. And, you know, it sounds awesome. But the thing is, that's going to cost money. And, you know, there are scholarships, and trust me, I've got the UTS scholarships page like permanently tabbed on my computer. Like, I am just refreshing that thing like every second day, checking like what am I eligible for, what's opened, what's like, even if I'm like only tick one of those criteria, I'm applying for everything. Because, you know, I need money to go over, but then I also need money to live here. So I'm working 3 jobs. I literally came late this morning because I was working in the boarding house this morning. And then straight after this, I've got tutoring with a peer student. So I'm working majority of my free time. And it's like what Eunice was saying, you know, you've got students who are doing their transfers 3 hours a day, and it does accumulate those hours of going to work, of working, and then coming back to make money to, one, live, but also to support whatever form of your education you need. It all banks up, because I don't know if other universities do it, but at UTS, they give you like your subject criteria, like layout, overview. And at the very top, it says how many hours you should dedicate to that subject. And I'm doing full-time study. Full-time study, part-time work, 0 time sleep, like it's, and you know, it's a lot.
Yeah, and it comes back to resources, doesn't it? Who's got resources, who hasn't, who has to spend time working, so less time studying. Not that you want less time studying, but you have it, yeah. Anyone else want to comment on that?
I'll jump in just to say incredible comments, throughout the panel, but specifically I think on this one, this is why it's so important to think about that kind of assumption level. We assume a lot of things about university students. We assume that it's easy to get to campus, it doesn't take that much time. We assume that they may be working 1 job or they have parental support. And we make a lot of those assumptions that then allow us to create these infrastructures that don't serve our students. So it comes back to what we've been talking about this whole time, which is about embedding that lived experience in a really complex, messy way. But specifically, I think it looks like challenging, particularly at a policy level, what those assumptions mean, and those taken for granted knowledges that come from, a lot of the time, our policymakers, you know, coming through a university system at the same time, everyone having a similar experience, and getting that diversity of information into that room. As we've all said multiple times, very, very important.
Yeah, thank you, Em. This is an interesting question. What meaning does the panel infer from the inability of the room to answer the cultural literacy questions posed in Uncle Michael West's Welcome to Country? Does anyone want to jump in?
I'll jump in just because I'm conscious that, again, we don't want to put the burden on the Indigenous students on the panel to have to answer that question. And so it's terrible. You know, it's, I'll say I don't come from this area, but I would like to be able to say that on Wurundjeri country, I'd be able to answer those questions, and I probably wouldn't. And I think that if that is something that is truly important to our universities, I will, go on a little bit of a tangent here. I think a lot of our universities have started embedding really strong Indigenous strategies. We have these great Indigenous strategy documents that look really impressive, and they talk about embedding Indigenous ways of knowing, being, doing. Now, I've tried to engage a lot with Indigenous knowledges in my kind of academic journey, and the fundamental thing that I keep coming back to is that relational aspect of learning and teaching and being. And in a context of staff cuts and resource constraints and dire funding needs that always come back to losing people, as we've discussed throughout this time, the capacity to actually practically embed those grand strategies doesn't actually look like what it says on the tin, you know. And so if we actually really want to think about what Indigenous ways of, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, but Indigenous ways of being, doing, knowing, those epistemologies look like in practice, we need to actually really think about what that means at the relational level and not just the box ticking of a grand Indigenous strategy.
Thanks, Sam. Lachlan, I'm looking at you because we mentioned in a previous discussion, or you did rather, you brought up about being realistic with change. Do you want to talk a little bit to that?
Is this like in regards to Indigenous education or just in general?
Just in general,
yeah. Yeah, I guess I said it before to policymakers, and you know, on that regard, being realistic to change. Like, yes, you got to focus on one thing at a time, and it does take a lot of time to make these changes. It's not going to happen just overnight. Something's going to magically change. And me being a bit of a history nerd, I can see Hannah over there. Hey, Hannah. She taught me at ACU, but I look at it like, you know, the comparables of when I'm studying the past time. How long do things take? I look at revolutions. Even those take many years, and they're supposed to be fast. That's the whole point of a revolution. I look at many, many things and I go, wow, this took so many years. And one thing I always look back to is the grungy strike, or wave hill walk-off. So Vincent Lingiari, 8 years, they went on strike for equal pay, land rights in Northern Territory. And like, that took 8 years of building, of protests, of strikes, just to get to a point where we got land rights. I'm looking at it from an Indigenous activist perspective, you know, that was like 50, 60 years ago. Yeah, there was Mabo in like the 90s and all that sort of stuff, but like that change, that, you know, stuff doesn't happen overnight. It takes decades, so many years, so much effort, so much time to be put into it. And I think for practitioners here, I think you got to consider, you know, that this stuff, it might not feel like much is being made. You're picking away slowly at the mountain, to say that, for that analogy. So let's, you know, be realistic here. Let's maybe set smaller goals in this journey of change, because, you know, all this stuff does take a lot of time, and yeah.
Yeah, perfect. And I think together you're showing how that it takes time for cultural change, which then will impact that structural change, right? So there's another question here. It says, for those from rural, remote areas, are you planning to move back home after graduating? Why not?
This is like a question that I've been thinking for a really long time, because I want to go into academia, and I would absolutely love back to my move back to my community after graduation, but I just can't, because like, what are my job prospects back home going into academia? And it's such a shame, but like, you know, all my role models are like my academics and lecturers and PhD students like Em. And I can't really unite those two parts of my world. I don't actually know what that's going to look like. It also depends on my success of whether I even become an academic or move into that sphere. But some part of me does see myself later in the future moving back home, or not necessarily back home, but back into the country where I really feel, connected. And I guess I would love to see representations of what that could look like in my field, outside of just going back and being a high school teacher.
Thank you. Anyone? Okay. I think it is time for us to wrap it up now. So I just want to thank the audience and everyone online for your really thoughtful and thought-provoking questions for the panel. But I really want to thank the panel for your generosity, one, of your valuable time that we've taken up today, but two, in your generosity, in your openness and your courageousness of sharing really openly your insights today. So can everyone please join me in thanking the panel?